Welcome to the Insomnia Coach podcast. My name is Martin Reed. I believe that nobody needs to live with chronic insomnia and that evidence-based cognitive and behavioral techniques can help you enjoy better sleep for the rest of your life. The content of this podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only. It's not medical advice and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease, disorder, or medical condition. It should never replace any advice given to you by your physician or any other licensed healthcare provider. Insomnia Coach LLC offers coaching services only and does not provide therapy, counseling, medical advice, or medical treatment. The statements and opinions expressed by guests are their own and are not necessarily endorsed by Insomnia Coach LLC. All content is provided as is and without warranties, either express or implied. Bill is a 57-year-old self-employed mechanical design engineer who lives in Australia with his wife and 3 children. In August 2018, Bill was admitted to hospital with a suspected heart attack, and this triggered an intense period of insomnia that led to progressively worse sleep. Bill soon found himself following a long list of pre-sleep rituals that did not improve his sleep, but did lead to more sleep-related worry. Fortunately, Bill was told about cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBT-I, and was able to get his sleep back on track. In this episode, Bill tells us how his insomnia developed, all the ways he tried unsuccessfully to improve his sleep, and he shares the specific techniques that he found to be most helpful for improving his sleep. A full transcript of this podcast and an accompanying video can be found at insomniacoach.com/podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on with us today, Bill.
My pleasure.
So let's start at the beginning. When did your sleep problems begin? And do you remember what initially triggered that sleep disruption?
Sleep problems really started in about February of this year. And it's been a part of, to be honest, I think in August last year, I was admitted to hospital with what was a suspected heart attack. Didn't turn out to be that, but it was an anxiety-related issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess in using a term that used to be used, it was probably what you might describe as a nervous breakdown in August last year.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been a very difficult last 12 or 14 months or so for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those ones where I guess in terms of mental health, they call it the Holy Trinity, I think. Anxiety, depression, insomnia, they all go together.
Mm-hmm.
So the insomnia part of it started, as I said, in February while I was away from home for a few days. The night where I got 0 sleep, which I don't think had ever happened to me that I can ever remember before. So after that, those nights of no sleep seemed to be happening just more and more frequently, and it just became very, very distressing, really. You end up just in this, I think, this sort of vicious circle where the insomnia feeds the anxiety and the depression becomes a bit worse, and you sort of just spiral down. So that's when it started.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone listening to this will really identify with you, like talking about this vicious cycle, whereas you start to worry about sleep becomes more difficult, and then it kind of leads to even more worry about sleep, which then makes sleep more difficult. So, and it can just seem like this cycle is just going to be endless, and it seems as though there's kind of like no way out. Was that kind of how you felt at the time, or?
Yeah, look, I think it's fair to say that you just become kind of quite desperate, really, especially if it's something that you haven't perhaps suffered with your whole life. You begin, or in my case anyway, start clutching around it for solutions anywhere you can find them. Sort of, reading a lot of books and um, trying different medications and visits to the doctor and all sorts of pre-sleep rituals that people swear by. And as of course you try harder and harder, sleep becomes more and more elusive, and so that's sort of that game. Doesn't really help you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you ever have any problems with sleep before this health issue that you experienced in August of last year?
I wouldn't say for my whole life I've been a great sleeper. I've been reasonably okay. I
Hmm.
obviously went through some patches of bad sleep when my children were young, as
Right.
everybody does. But I think probably in my case, to be honest, I had a traumatic event in childhood. My mother died when I was 3, and I think ever since then I've really probably slept, not as well as I could have.
Mm. Yeah.
So it's probably an on and off been a bit of a lifelong issue.
Yeah. And how was your sleep? You mentioned that everything really kind of came to a head in February, but you kind of had this health issue back in August. How was your sleep, between that period, between August and February? Was there like minimal impact and it just all came to a head when you had that night of no sleep, or was it kind of disrupted in between as well?
I think it could say between, say, August and that period, it was disrupted.
Hmm.
Um, but I certainly hadn't had prior to February any nights of where I couldn't sleep at all. So I
Mm.
might have had sleep that wasn't as good as it could be, but I wasn't at a level where I felt I couldn't really I couldn't really cope with it. It was after
Mm.
February when I started getting sometimes not just one night of no sleep, but I remember one weekend where I had 2 nights of no sleep, and that to me was just the absolute pits. I couldn't
Mm.
really. I was found it very, very hard after that second night of no sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think everyone's going to really identify with what you're saying, just because for a lot of people, there is this quite identifiable event or issue that either disrupts sleep or makes sleep worse than it normally is. Because for a lot of people with insomnia, they've tended to always have, you know, maybe more disrupted sleep, but never been that big of a problem. They've just recognized that maybe they're not one of these great natural sleepers. But then
Yeah,
once you have that one night of like no sleep, like you describe, and that kind of raises your worry. And then if it turns into two, that can really feel as though just the wheels are coming off, and that maybe
yeah.
did you kind of feel like get concerned that maybe you've kind of like lost the ability to sleep, or that there was something else that was really wrong or anything like that?
Well, I knew, physically I'd had everything checked out with my heart, so I knew that
Mm.
was probably all. Um, there was nothing obvious that I could see that was physically wrong,
Hmm.
but I was seriously having worries about my mental health really around that time. When
Mm.
it's sort of it just sends you kind of half crazy, I guess, in a way. And I just worried that I think primarily the worry is that you just won't be able to cope anymore with
Mm.
life almost, because you when you're in the middle of a period like that, you just feel like um, you know you can't cope with doing things anymore. And so me being a bit of a catastrophizing type
Mm.
thinker, which is something I'm trying to deal with in other ways, but it leads you to start worrying that, well, if I can't get any sleep, I won't be able to work anymore, and then the wheels will fall off as far as uh, just basically um, providing for the family. And so you start thinking one one thing after another, and it all becomes just a huge snowball of worry
Yeah.
that's very difficult to get on top of. So I think that's the point where many people, including me, sort of say, well, surely there must be some drug that can at least help me get over this hump, this short term, whether it's a hump or, but just to basically, get things back in some kind of order to be able to make sense of it all. I think that's when, people, and I did the same thing. I took some Valium at that time, which I hate, but that's why you go down that path, I guess.
Yeah, I was actually just about to move on to that. So, what kind of things did you do? When you noticed these nights of no sleep at all started to crop up, was it a case that you just went to the doctor and they suggested medication, or did you just feel that medication would be the thing that would help you get back on track? Was there anything else that you tried before going that route?
Well, I felt I'd tried many of the, many books obviously suggest a lot of pre-bedtime rituals and, relaxation techniques and, warm baths and herbal teas and things before bed. And there's a long list of things that people swear by.
Mm.
Insomnia is one of those things where everyone has a different suggestion that they're only trying to help, of course, but if you wrote them all down and tried them all, you'd be busy for about 3 or 4 hours before
Oh
you
yeah.
actually went to bed. But yeah, look, I think it's when I was having that period of successive nights of no sleep, I was aware of the fact that many of these things that you can try are take a fair while to actually work, and you're really looking for something quite short term. I'd known from previous experience from taking a temazepam in hospital, which is another one of those benzodiazepines, that those things worked for me in terms of at least being able to get a night of sleep. So I'd when I went to the doctor the next day after that, he obviously explained to me all the risk of the benzodiazepines, which I already knew,
Mm.
but he prescribed me some anyway, just for some short-term relief. And so I did take those, and they did at least allow me to get some sleep and start start getting my head back in order a little bit, enough
Hmm.
to function and take some more sort of, shall we say, longer term decisions.
Mm.
Um, so um, anyway, from that point, I I started to look in some other directions. Yeah, other than, because I knew that the benzodiazepines weren't the answer, and I knew all about how addictive they were, and I was very keen not to go down that path.
Hmm.
Um,
So I think that you mentioned when we were talking before this call, you mentioned that at one point you had a sleep study done. Was that before before you started to look to taking the medication, or was this after, or where did the sleep study fit in with regards to your sleep history?
yeah, so I think after February, um, things were certainly not getting better on the insomnia front. I'd had a trip to New Zealand with my wife, which was I'd had a few nights there which were pretty poor.
Mm.
We'd had a weekend away at a nice, relaxing spa town in Victoria, and the night we had at the hotel, I could feel that I was about to have a second night of no sleep. So
Mhm.
we disrupted we disrupted that particular night with a midnight trip back home, so I could sleep in my home bed. So that disrupted that nice weekend away. And it was
Mm.
really after that I started thinking, well, what else can I do? And there was a place nearby, at a local hospital, which was a fairly well regarded sort of sleep clinic. And so I was fortunate to be able to get to see one of their sleep doctors quite quickly. And he sort of had a look at me and said, well, you might have sleep apnea based on your physiology. I said, I don't think I have sleep apnea, because my wife would know, um, whether I had that.
Mm.
But anyway, he said, you need to do a sleep study. And that was anyone who's contemplating one of those things, I found that to be a very expensive sort of waste of time. If you've ever had one of these things done, you basically go into hospital, and they sort of wire you up like Frankenstein with electrodes and things all over your head.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how anybody could possibly sleep at all with all those wires and things coming off them. But in any event, I did that, and the diagnosis of that was no sleep apnea. But the sleep doctor recommended two things: medication and CBT.
Mm-hmm.
So in my case, the medication that he recommended was some drug called gabapentin, plus a synthetic sort of melatonin. And so I started to take that, and I also he recommended a local therapist in Melbourne that could do the CBT stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but she had like a 3 or 4 month rather waiting list to see her, so that was no use to me. But there was an online CBT course that can be done in Australia, so I started. This is before I came across you and your site, so
Mm-hmm.
I'd started that for 4 or 5 weeks before I sort of had a look at your forum and started chatting to you.
Mm-hmm.
So I was familiar with CBT from some other work that I'd done related to anxiety, and that I'd found that very helpful. So I was already, pretty confident that the CBT, and particularly the sleep restriction, was going to, based on everything I'd read about it, was going to be effective.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I found that it sure was.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I think, first of all, I was really happy when you told me that you had the sleep study done, just to rule out sleep apnea, but that whoever you were working with at the sleep study suggested cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBT-I. I just found that really encouraging, because it needs to be recommended to everyone with chronic insomnia, but that's so very rarely the case. So people are just focusing all their attention on these techniques that are more related to sleep hygiene that aren't very helpful. Like you described them as all these pre-sleep rituals, like taking that hot bath, doing this, doing that, maybe having the blackout curtains, doing the sound machines, trying to limit your exposure to light, all these things that aren't actually that helpful when you've got chronic insomnia. But you were kind of prompted to look into CBT-I. And I just found that part of your story just so encouraging, because you were kind of given that opportunity. You were directed down the route that ultimately helped you get your sleep back on track.
Yeah, look, this is what I found this very interesting, because this chap that I saw, I won't give his name, but he's really a very eminent sleep physician in Australia. And, I found it interesting, really, that he has a practice where he's booked up with patients for 3 or 4 months. Obviously, people going there pretty desperate, like me, to get some answers for sleep. But really, if his if you don't have sleep apnea, the only things that they can recommend, or a doctor can recommend, is medication. We know medication is really just a band-aid measure to try to sort of get you back on track, like I was. But so the only real tool he could offer was CBT, which was not actually something he could directly do anything about. He sort of left it then entirely up to me to go and find what the best CBT resource was. So effectively, it was a doctor that had no, if you like, no tools in his arsenal to actually help me with, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I do, absolutely, because I hear this like a lot. I do hear it a lot. So a lot of people, they'll seek medical advice, and maybe even CBT wouldn't even get discussed. It would just be the default option would be some kind of prescription medication. But at the times when CBT-I is discussed, a lot of the doctors, it sounds like it's a similar situation in Australia, but here in the States, there's a really limited kind of referral network, so doctors that do know about CBTI, they don't really have the time to engage in it in their own practice. But at the same time, they don't really have this referral network. So they can, like you just experienced, they can say, yeah, try CBTI, good luck, and kind of send you on your way. And you don't really have
Yeah,
anyone that you can directly work with. It is a big problem.
yeah, it is. I think it's a huge problem. I think the more enlightened doctors would know a bit about it. But I've spent my life as a design engineer designing medical devices, and so I work with the medical profession quite closely. And the word to describe CBT in insomnia and in anxiety as well is gold standard. Now, gold
Mm.
standard means what those two words are significant. It means there is no better treatment modality than this. So if you want to, and the other thing that maybe people with insomnia perhaps aren't quite aware of is CBT isn't some hick thing that sounds a bit hippie-ish and somebody just thought was a good idea. It's got an extensive amount of clinical evidence behind it. If you actually researched it and have a look at the technical papers about it online and the number of people that have been studied that have been through it, the numbers, I'm a real numbers guy. The numbers don't lie, and that was why I was so confident, really, that when I started it, I had a very good feeling that it was going to work, and it did.
Yeah, and I think that actually the reason why it's so effective is because it just gets to the bottom of all these factors that perpetuate the problem. So we have this model of insomnia that where we describe how insomnia develops from just this one night of poor sleep. We have this precipitating event, but it's all the things we kind of do in response that perpetuate the problem. So for example, all this worry about sleep, or maybe all this research, trying to go to bed earlier in the night, spending longer in bed, maybe napping during the day, trying to conserve energy, catastrophizing about the effects of sleep, all these things that just perpetuate the problem and make it really hard for our sleep to get back on track. CBTI just addresses all of these perpetuating factors, and that's why I think it's so effective for everyone with chronic insomnia.
Yeah, I agree. I think the biggest thing about it, really, that works is the hardest thing about it, which is the sleep restriction, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But my issue was with all of the pre-sleep rituals. I could get myself into a state where I was before bed. I was as calm as a Buddhist monk. I'd be sitting sitting down in a chair reading a book and fighting sleep almost to stay awake till the sleep window thing started. And then at the start of before CBT, I suppose I could be really tired, but put my head on the pillow, and then suddenly, I'm sure lots of people have this sleep onset anxiety. Suddenly, bang, you're wide awake, and you're wide awake because you're anxious about getting a bad sleep and think, oh no, not this again. But sure enough, that's what happens with this sleep onset anxiety. And I think, with the sleep restriction, I think what happens is you just get the difficulty with it is you just get so overwhelmingly tired that you get to a point where your head hits the pillow and somehow you do just go to sleep. And suddenly, once you get into this pattern of that happening a few times, the sleep onset anxiety seems to just wither away. And I found that, as I said, that sleep restriction part of this program very difficult but necessary. And that's the thing that works the best.
Yeah, it is so helpful, especially when arousal is a problem, when you've got this high level of sleep related anxiety, just because it helps to build that sleep drive. And once your sleep drive gets to a point, like you said, you recognize that you are going to sleep. You can't stay awake indefinitely. So you kind of train yourself to recognize that once you get this intense level of sleepiness, you are going to sleep. But in combination, when you've got this higher level of sleep drive, kind of just takes the edge off of that high level of anxiety. It's like these two competing factors, and you can kind of use sleep drive to your advantage and help overpower, that anxiety that you're feeling that's making it hard to fall asleep.
For sure. Yeah, I agree.
So for people that aren't familiar with sleep restriction, basically what it's about is just reducing the amount of time that you allot for sleep to just more closely match the amount of sleep you're currently getting on an average night. So it's not about forcing yourself to sleep less. It's just giving yourself a more appropriate amount of time, a more appropriate length of opportunity for sleep. So when you were implementing this, what kind of sleep window were you looking at? How much time are you spending in bed before sleep restriction? And once you implemented the technique, roughly, if you remember, how much time were you allotting for sleep then?
Yeah, so before the CBT-I, I think one of my problems was I was getting so tired that I would be thinking, I think I'll go to bed early tonight, and try to get a big catch-up sleep, so I might go to bed at, say, 9 p.m. and say after a couple of rough nights, might actually have a big sleep, maybe even 8 or 9 hours of sleep. But the problem is that when that pattern starts to happen, you're sort of setting yourself up for a cycle of big sleeps, no sleeps, big sleeps, no sleeps. It's very peaky,
Yeah.
and you're not sort of really kind of getting anywhere. With the sleep restriction, you tend to obviously not have those great big sleeps, but you're trying to sort of balance it out more to get, maybe in the first week, as I did, you'll only average 5.5 hours of sleep per night, but at least each night you're getting some sleep, so you're not having those debilitating nights of no sleep. But getting back to your question, as far as the word sleep efficiency goes, in other words, how much time you're actually spending asleep divided by how much time you're in bed, I think before I started the CBT, my sleep efficiency would have been maybe 70%, something like that. After 6 or 7 weeks after doing the CBT, it was up around like 95.
Wow.
I was falling asleep in 5 or 10 minutes. Up once in the middle of the night, I'd go back to sleep in 5 minutes, and that's pretty much where I am now.
That's fantastic, and I think you made a really good point about when we allot this huge chunk of time for sleep because we want to get that much sleep. The problem that we have is we do experience this roller coaster, where one night we might be in bed for 8-9 hours and get very little sleep, and then after a few days, because our sleep drive just becomes so intense, we get that big chunk of 8 or 9 hours of sleep, right? Only to then, once that sleep drive has been reduced, to go back to struggling again. So you're just dealing with these ups and downs, which is just so frustrating. And the sleep window really helps you kind of even out those highs and lows and just consolidate sleep. Was that how you experienced it too?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And to me, it was really the those nights of no sleep, which were the debilitating thing. And once the sleep restriction was sort of put that into place, things started to improve. So with the CBT, I think the first couple of weeks I was around 5.5 hours average sleep, probably 80% sleep efficiency. By week 7, I'd gotten up to about nearly around about 7 hours average sleep, sometimes as much as 7.5, with 95% sleep efficiency, and that continued for about 3 weeks. I then sort of went backwards for a couple of weeks. Week 11 and 12, there were some issues that happened there, which caused me to go back to about 6 hours sleep a night, and my sleep efficiency dropped away again to about sort of mid 70s, and then after that, and for the last 4 weeks, I'm back to about sort of 7 hours of sleep a night and sort of 85-90% sleep efficiency.
Yeah.
So, and that's, but really over the last 4 weeks, I think probably only had one bad night of sleep,
Yeah.
and which was probably a couple of hours. But I still expect to have a bad night of sleep here and there. It's just par for the course for me. So I don't get too worried about that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that's important to emphasize too, is because when you're going through this process of getting your sleep back on track, it's so easy to dwell on any bad nights that you have along the way, or to expect that your progress should just be completely incremental. Every night should be an improvement on the last night. But it's completely normal for sleep to be disrupted, because even the best sleepers in the world will always have a bad night every now and then.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's so important to just recognize that a bad night is normal, and that ultimately it's kind of our response to that bad night that determines how quickly our sleep is just going to recover from that bad night.
Yeah, that's very true. I think, in with the bad nights, I think, it's sort of baked into the program of CBT, more or less, that you are going to still have the odd bad night,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe a few of them in the week. And the difficulty I think people will tend to face is they'll look at those bad nights and not be thinking clearly enough and say, "Oh, this program isn't working," so I'll abandon it. I think that's where it's really important. I think anyone who's doing this CBT-I to be a bit rigorous about the sleep diaries. As I said, I'm a real numbers guy, and so I was pretty rigid about the sleep diaries, and also I still use a spreadsheet to actually track not just my sleep, but things like how my mood is going during the day, and some other things which help me with. They basically just help me to look at things from more of a macro perspective, to say, look, on balance, this trend is getting better, and ignore the outliers in the data, the one or two bad nights of sleep here and there. Generally, the trend is improving. So for me, those numbers were really helpful. But yeah, so I would say anyone doing CBT, don't get disillusioned by the few nights you'll have a bad sleep. Have a look at the overall numbers and the patterns there. Be very, very patient with yourself. Don't. In my case, it sort of took 6 or 7 weeks for things to start being noticeably better, and that's quite a long time. So those are the main things, I think.
I think that's really good advice. It is. We have to make a conscious effort to look at the better nights, because otherwise our brain will just default all of its focus on those bad nights, right?
Yeah,
Because they're the problem areas. So our brain wants to solve the problem areas. So it completely ignores any good nights and just focuses on all the bad nights, or all the nights that you weren't satisfied with.
yeah, that's true. I mean, people with insomnia like me are more likely than not to be people that tend to be a bit anxious anyway, and
Mm-hmm.
people who are a bit anxious tend to, maybe a bit like me, catastrophize more about the bad times than they do to sort of celebrate what's happening with the good ones, if you know what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Oh, I completely understand. And it's also really important to recognize that you're implementing changes that are a long-term approach. So you're implementing things today that are going to reap benefits for months and years and decades down the line. So it
Yeah,
really is important to take that long-term view. So how you slept last night or how you're going to sleep tomorrow night, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't really matter. It's all about just implementing these techniques and staying committed to them in order to get those long-term improvements that you're looking for.
for sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
And when you do get those improvements, I spoke before about that vicious cycle, but you can start creating a virtuous cycle when things start to improve. That you'll find when insomnia starts to improve, anxiety sometimes just gets, doesn't seem quite so so bad, and depression starts to lift, and everything starts looking a lot better in life.
Completely agree. And this is something that I talk a lot about with clients, is that could, because they recognize this vicious cycle, the way that more anxiety leads to more sleep disruption, and that leads to more sleep anxiety. But the great thing with these CBTI techniques is, as soon as you kind of get that first night, when you first recognize that, for example, sleep restriction is working, and you've got that really intense sleep drive, really struggling to stay awake, and you fall asleep, and you get that night, and it's kind of like this discovery that, oh, I can sleep, things can improve, and that kind of just chips away at the worry a little bit. And as
Oh
that
yeah.
worry goes down, you find sleep a little bit easier. And then
Mm.
as a result, the worry goes down even more. And as a result, sleep becomes easier. So it's kind of a positive cycle. It turns that vicious cycle completely on its head and just really helps you improve.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I know you mentioned in your email to me before this talk that there's a lot of doom and gloom about insomnia, and there sure is, because it's a rotten problem. But
Mm.
yeah, if you can get on top of it, I can remember that feeling when I first put together kind of 2 or 3 nights in a row of 7-ish hours of sleep, and with very little interruption in the middle of the night. And oh my goodness, it was such a blissful feeling in the morning to wake up
Mm.
and think, oh, that's what life is.
Mm.
Waking up feeling refreshed, rather than waking up or not even waking up, but getting up in the morning thinking, oh, I feel terrible, I haven't had any sleep last night, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's that was your reward for going through that short-term struggle, and just being
Yeah,
committed to that sleep window, because it does take time for you to see those results. And in the short
yeah,
term, like you described, it can be really challenging, and it can be
it is.
so tempting to just give up and just say, this isn't working. And then kind of be back to square one. But I find, in my experience, that the people that just stick with it, they'll get results and they'll notice improvements in their sleep. But it definitely can be a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
hard.
Did you find any other CBTI techniques helpful, or was it just primarily just this sleep restriction and just observing this more appropriate sleep window?
Well, I think that the two major things were really were the sleep restriction, and probably the idea of going to bed at a fairly late hour for me, 11,
Mm-hmm.
11:30. I found that really challenging to stay up till that time, especially when you've had a lot of nights of restricted sleep.
Mm.
But I felt that was really helpful as well. And um, I'm still doing that now, going to bed much later than I used to, and
Mm.
I find that very helpful.
Yeah.
But those were the two main things that I remember anyway as being the
Yeah.
most. Well, that plus keeping the sleep diaries. I think those were all of the things that really helped me.
Mm. What kind of things would you do in the evening? Like in the early days of sleep restriction, a lot of people um, struggle with staying awake until the start of the sleep window. So they're always looking for ideas on like things to do to prevent them from prematurely falling asleep. Did you have any specific strategies for that?
Yeah, so I found that period of trying to when you're feeling very tired and trying to stay awake till 11, 11:30, really hard. I would find myself, if I was reading a book or listening to some music or watching TV, kind of doing this micro sleep thing where you just sort of keep nodding off, and then I don't think that was very helpful in terms of then when you finally do want to get to sleep.
Mm.
It's sort of like um, for if you get into that pattern, the way I think of it is that for a couple of hours before you're actually going to sleep, your brain is saying, "Don't go to sleep, don't go to sleep," and then all of a sudden you're going to go to bed, and you want your brain to say, "Now go to sleep." Well, it's sort of like all these mixed messages, and you just. I found that when my head hit the pillow, I was just I would be almost about to fall asleep, and my brain would suddenly say, "Don't go to sleep, don't go to sleep," like it was fighting micro sleep still. So those micro sleeps I found weren't helpful. So activity which isn't um, overly exertive, I think, in that finding some activity that you can do in those few hours before bed is really helpful. In my case, I can do some music practice because I play trombone, so that was good. But
Mhm.
the biggest thing for me was I found going for a really long walk. This is a bit weird, but going for a really long walk at, say, um, even 10 o'clock or 9:30, and maybe an hour walk or more, I found that really helpful,
Mhm.
because it would make me tired enough that that would help me to go to sleep. But I wasn't, obviously you can't micro sleep while you're going for a walk. But it's sort of also not a form of activity which is too demanding, so that you're
Mm.
all pumped up like going to the gym or something, and then you're actually too alert to go to sleep.
Mhm.
So yeah, lots of moonlight walking for
Mm.
me
Yeah.
was really helpful.
Yeah, I think that is a good tip, and I like to say anything that gets you moving, because it's
Yeah.
very hard to fall asleep when you're moving. So
Yes.
even if the idea of going outdoors and going for a walk in the evening isn't appealing, then even if it just involves standing up and moving just around your own home, even just
Yeah.
some light chores, even just anything that keeps you moving can really help if you're finding yourself struggling to stay awake in the short term to the start of that
Yeah.
sleep window.
Yeah. I would totally agree with that.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's talk about how long it took for you to notice these improvements in your sleep. I think you kind of touched upon this. So, like, really, I think you mentioned like 7 to 8 weeks was when you got to that point where you felt that you'd made real progress. But how long was it until things like clicked and you actually recognized that the techniques you were implementing were just actually making a difference and were helping you?
So around about week 5, I think I could definitely see that I was making some progress. I was probably, I'd certainly increased my sleep window was getting wider,
Hmm.
and I could see my sleep efficiency was getting better. Um, so I'd certainly started to see some progress by week 5. It was sort of like almost a sudden switch from week 4 to week 5. Up to week 4, uh, everything felt like it was taking a long time to
Mm.
fall into place. But yeah, by week 5, things were certainly noticeably improving. And then, as I said, by week 7, I was sleeping pretty well.
Hmm.
Yeah,
That's great. I think it's really important for people to hear that, just because if you'd have given up, halfway through week 3, for example, then you wouldn't be where you are now. But it was your perseverance, that you carried on with these techniques and you got to that point where you did get the results. And that's really important for people to hear, I think.
yeah. Well, yeah. I think, as I said, for me, it was really that's where the numbers become really important. Not only your own numbers as far as the sleep diary and the trends, but if you're that way inclined, jump online and Google the myriads of clinical data that's actually out there and read some papers on CBT and insomnia, and then you'll begin to realize why it's called the gold standard. Because and for people who have insomnia, um, there really isn't much else. I hate to tell you, but it's either CBT or medication. If you hate medication, then you don't have too many other choices, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and and it's a real shame that we don't see more information about CBTI out there. That you kind of do have to dig deep into this scientific realm of journals, and it's not like in the mass media, like all the scary headlines about insomnia, and all the sleep hygiene advice is often the first thing that you'll see. Where we Can you imagine what kind of world we'd live in if all the newspapers were reporting stories on CBTI success rates and looking at people that implemented CBT-I techniques and got their sleep back on track, we would just live in such a better world, and I think insomnia would be far less of a problem.
Yeah, well, we do live in a world where, everybody, including me, would ideally like a quick fix. We
Mm.
would love to be able to take a pill which solved the problem tomorrow, which didn't give us any nasty side effects. And that's why the market for medication for insomnia is as massive as it is, because everybody wants that. But the reality is that, unfortunately, the side effects with so many of these medications are so awful that, you sort of you might be partially solving one problem, but you're creating another massive problem, which the doctors don't tell you with a lot of these medications what is actually involved if you actually want to withdraw from them at a later stage. And anybody that's been on any of these medications and has tried to withdraw from them will know how difficult that can be. So yeah, I don't see medication as the answer. So as I said, I think this is the only solution.
Yeah, and I think that is part of the problem, right? Is because we can take a medication and feel as though we're sleeping better, but because it doesn't get to the root cause of the problem that's perpetuating the insomnia, like CBTI does, as soon as you start to decide to stop taking the medication or try and taper off it, often your sleep issues can return. And so then you're trapped into this, well, what do I do now? Does this mean I have to take medication forever?
Mm, yeah, well, that's right.
Yeah.
They really at best. I think they have a place when you're at a crisis point and you
Hmm.
just need some relief. But and that's certainly the what that Valium did help me, I guess, from that perspective. But you really, I think you'd be wise to only view them as a very temporary kind of band-aid, like putting a band-aid on a cut or trying to
Hmm.
staunch a wound. Um, Unfortunately, the solution isn't which is CBT, isn't a quick fix.
Hmm.
But as I said, I just think it's the only solution, really.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I do think that these sleeping medications definitely have their place in the short term, but they are never a long term solution for people with chronic insomnia.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, Bill. So I know I've taken a lot of your time today, and I just have one last question for you.
Sure.
Um, if someone with chronic insomnia is listening and they feel as though they've tried everything, they're beyond help, and they can't do anything to improve their sleep, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question. So, if somebody who had chronic insomnia, for instance, and tried CBTI really properly and given it a good go, and that hadn't worked for them, then um, I think that's possibly a position that many people on your forum that I've had a look at are in. Then my it's only a suggestion because I'm not an expert like you, but I think that essentially underlying all insomnia is probably has to be really anxiety. And I think, therefore, the answer lies in trying to get to the root of what is actually the cause of the anxiety. Where does this actually come from? In my case, it goes back a long way into childhood.
Mm.
But there's basically, um, I think what people would need to do would be to go into that, and with some perhaps a psychologist to try to understand where the anxiety is coming from, and then try to deal with it. But so in my case, I think over the last 14 months, there's lots and lots of things that I've done with meditation, mindfulness. I've gone back to church, which has helped a lot. I've had a psychologist that I've worked with for a year. I've gotten sort of more in touch with my inner me and deeper
Mm.
self, and started pursuits again like music that I really love. Um, you know, Deepened connections with family and friends. Used massage. hugs.
Mm.
I've really cut down on my work, which has been, a super important part of all this, to de-stress life, so that you're not going to sleep and thinking, oh my God, I've got 6 client meetings the next day. I'm down to a couple of days a week, which can still manage with. So lots and lots of things, and they're all little things, but when you add them all up, they make a big effect on just reducing anxiety overall. Now, I know not everybody is in that position, but as I said, my biggest advice would be to say, well, why are you so anxious? Can you actually think of when you became anxious? Can you actually think back of a time when you used to sleep well, and what was going on in your life back then? Were things a lot simpler? And can you actually make some efforts or strides to get back to that point when life was a bit simpler and you weren't so anxious? So yeah, it's not an easy answer to the question, and again, it's not a quick fix, but essentially I think that's where, probably for a lot of people, that's probably where the root of the problem is.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will identify with what you've said for sure. And I think it can be really helpful if, following your advice, you kind of look to uncover what those thoughts are that are generating this anxiety. And especially if you can work on that in combination with the behavioral side of CBT-I, you can really maximize your chance of this long-term success, because whilst you're working on the more cognitive, the more like analyzing your thoughts side of things, but at the same time implementing appropriate behaviors around sleep, like not going to bed until you're sleepy enough for sleep, and getting out of bed when you're struggling, that kind of two-prong approach can really be helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, totally agree.
All right, Bill. Well, thank you again so much for coming on. I think it's always great for people to hear these success stories, these transformations. I think it can just provide reassurance, and it can also just give people that motivation, especially if maybe they've tried CBT-I in the past for a couple of weeks and didn't find it helpful, maybe to just give it another try, just with the idea that it's really this long-term approach, and that you've really got to give it that time to notice the results.
Yeah, well, I also just wanted to thank you, and there's not many, shall we say, beacons or lighthouses out there in the wilderness for people who are suffering from insomnia, and you're certainly one of them. And your forums and your advice are, a huge help, quite life-changing to many people. So, I just wanted to thank you for doing this, and all your helpful advice as well.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And of course, you're very welcome. Thanks again, Bill.
Okay. Thanks, Martin. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Insomnia Coach podcast. If you're ready to implement evidence-based cognitive and behavioral techniques to improve your sleep, but think you might need some additional support and guidance, I would love to help. There are 2 ways we can work together. First, you can get my online coaching course. This is the most popular option. My course combines sleep education with individualized coaching and is guaranteed to improve your sleep. You will learn new ways of thinking about sleep and implement better sleep habits over a period of 8 weeks. This gives you time to build sleep confidence and notice results without feeling overwhelmed. You can get the course and start right now at insomniacoach.com/online. I also offer a phone coaching package where we start with a 1-hour call. This can be voice only or video, your choice, and we come up with an initial 2-week plan that will have you implementing cognitive and behavioral techniques that will lead to long-term improvements in your sleep. You get unlimited email-based support and guidance for 2 weeks after the call, along with a half-hour follow-up call at the end of the 2 weeks. You can book the phone coaching package at insomniacoach.com/phone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Insomnia Coach podcast. I'm Martin Reed, and as always, I'd like to leave you with this important reminder. You can sleep.